There's like no way it won't be. Little late on people today. Who knows? People have lives, and I don't know. I thought it was the actual fire alarm, and I was like, well, that'll be an interesting start to class. Okay. So just sort of looking ahead, on Monday, we have a discussion day. Make sure you've done the reading. Then we'll cover learning theory. Have a discussion day for that, cover biotheory. And then have a discussion day for that, and then we'll have our next exam. So this next one is like a little more compressed. You know, teaching with a little few extra challenges here. And then after that, we'll be doing our sorry, I need a second here. We'll be doing our simulation. There we go. I have just shown the documentary about the Stanford prison experiment in my intro class. So whenever I say simulation, I think I don't know if you guys have seen the video, but there's a guy who's like, this is an simulation. It's just like stuck in my head. Alrighty, so we've been talking about focusing on single traits. And a lot of people do that in research. And that's where a lot of really good research gets done in personality and social psych and clinical psych. Now we're going to talk about the essential trait approach. So the idea here is which traits are most important. Which traits really matter? And this approach tries to reduce many down to a few traits. So there are some theoretical approaches here. Murray came up with 20 needs, he called them. A psychologist whose last name was Block came up with 2, ego control, which is essentially being able to, it's like delay of gratification, essentially. And then ego resiliency, which is you've been through really tough times and you can still bounce back. But like a lot of the research in this area, most of what happens is based on factor analytic approaches. So Eysenck is one of the big names here, and he came up with sort of big 3: extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. So very balanced towards psychopathology, right? Eysenck also was a little bit theoretical because he based his model on the idea that important traits should be heritable. And so there's a little bit of like the biotheory in here. He emphasized the social role, and he insisted that things he studied be observable. So he wanted observable behaviors. So psychoticism for him is a blend of aggressiveness, creativity, and impulsiveness. Neuroticism is emotional reactivity and emotionality. And then really interestingly, extroversion is sociability, which is what we think of it. But for Eysenck, it also included impulsiveness, which we don't typically think of necessarily as like an extroverted trait. And what's really interesting is that extroversion and neuroticism have sometimes been referred to as the big 2 traits, because these are ones that we see come up essentially across all cultures when we do big 5 type research. I'm gonna take a sec to check in the folks who have signed on. So when we do research on the big 5, they might vary from culture to culture, but extroversion and neuroticism come up over and over and over. Cattell, we talked about briefly when we talked about assessment. Oh yeah, sorry.
So if, for honestly, if extroversion and psychoticism both have impulsiveness under them, was there like a difference in the type of impulsiveness, or they're just the same thing?
Legit question. I think they're just correlates and they overlap, right? And so this is part of the problem with the essential trait approach, right? Is that for years and years, and really some of the research still now, a lot of this stuff overlaps. So it's like the original MMPI, how we talked about that, like the same items were on different subscales because it just represented distress, right? So I think that that's part of what's going on here. That's a good question. So Cattell came up with 16 essential traits. If you remember, he created the 16PF to represent those traits. I'm just realizing, oh, he's down there. Oh, well, I'll go back to Tellegen in a sec here. And recently people have said 16 is too many. We can't have 16 essential traits. Cattell is really like the gold standard though for how you do this type of research, because he collected huge amounts of data. He looked at behavior in everyday settings, he did questionnaire data, he had lab data with psychophysical measurements, so things like skin conductance, heart rate, Not sure if he got into like cortisol levels, but that's something people have done. So certainly someone who was really serious about doing this well. And then Tellegen, I believe might have recently passed away, which is really sad because he is like one of the hugest names in like really good research. But he looked at positive emotionality, negative emotionality, and constraint. And these three end up kind of being similar to Eysenck's three. So like extroversion is related to positive emotionality. Neuroticism essentially is negative emotionality. And then psychoticism is sort of lack of constraint, if that makes sense. Tellegen, very respected researcher, works a lot on the MMPI. I believe he's co-author of the MMPI 2RF and the MMPI 3, along with my former professor, Yossi Ben-Poreth. And of course, we've already mentioned in passing during our culturals lecture about the Big Five. So let's talk about them in a lot more detail now, because they are sort of the leading version of the trait. Again, it's not really a theory, the trait approach, maybe. And so the Big Five were based initially off of something called the lexical hypothesis. And the lexical hypothesis says important aspects of our lives will be labeled with words. And if something is truly important and universal, there will be many words for it, not only within one language, but across all languages. So you want to look for traits that have the most words and are the most universal across languages. And so the lexical hypothesis initial data literally was going through dictionaries, finding words related to personality, and then essentially pulling those out, analyzing just the words, giving the words to people to rate as to how much it applied to themselves, and then going from there. I'm gonna take a sec and go close that outside door because it's either hot or it's smoke. I can't tell which through my mask, but it's pretty bad. That's also where the big hissing noise is coming from, so maybe it'll be a little less distracting. Okay. So once you had all these words and had people respond to all these words, then you did factor analysis to try to see how do these words bunch up? What kind of traits do we see? And what we tended to see is the Big Five, these 5 traits. So some implications of this approach. Traits are orthogonal. Orthogonal is a fancy word for unrelated, right? So something's continuous. You might look at, take something like extroversion, introversion, right? Introversion is considered at one end of the scale, extroversion at the other. If something's orthogonal, like extroversion and neuroticism, say, each are going to be on their own scale. There's been some really interesting things with like single trait approaches with this. So for example, in my subfield, we found that body appreciation, or appreciating what your body can do, instead of focusing on how your body looks, is a completely different trait than body dissatisfaction. Like they kind of vary with each other, but they're not two ends of the same spectrum. The Big Five can bring order to many research findings if the findings are consistent with one of these particular traits. And the Big Five are more complex than they seem at first. The labels may be oversimplified, and that can perhaps be misleading. So we're going to go through each of the Big Five in ocean order so that we can kind of look at them a little bit more. So openness to experience is also sometimes called intellect, which is really interesting because we don't necessarily think of intelligence as a personality trait, right? Like that's like a cognitive trait. But intellect is more interest in learning, right? This one is the most controversial trait and also one of the ones that's most hard to replicate across cultures. Its approach to intellectual matters, or again, basic intelligence, just doesn't feel right to me as someone who studied neuropsychology. It's not a personality trait. It's also the value of cultural matters. So people who are high on openness to experiences are people who appreciate literature and art. People who love to go to art museums, things along those lines. As I just mentioned, and creativity and perceptiveness. They notice things around them. They're very creative folks, people who are high on this. As I just mentioned, this is less replicable across different samples within the same culture and across different cultures. People who are high on this trait are viewed by others as creative. They're also seen as open-minded and clever. And then the life outcomes, there could be good and bad. Because you're more open to things, you might be more likely to use substances, which is fine unless those substances become an addiction and take over your life, right? But then some good things. These folks might be folks who have artistic interests, folks who are our next Van Gogh or Picasso. All right, conscientiousness, not consciousness, conscientiousness is responsibility, consistency, moral reasoning. So in some ways, it's kind of like the superego, but a little more specific. There has been a lot of shift to using the Big Five as like employee selection or employee like job placement criteria. And research actually backs that up, which is great, as opposed to the Myers-Briggs, which not so much. So when this is used to select employees, the predictive validity for supervisor ratings of job performance. So you have someone who on an initial like job interview level, Big Five questionnaire scores high on this. That predicts that they'll get good supervisor ratings at 0.41 level, which is pretty strong correlation, especially for something predictive. It also can predict absenteeism or the lack thereof if you're high on it, employee theft if you're low on it, and I just mentioned job performance. Measuring this is a lot less biased than giving people like aptitude tests. And it predicts success in college and well. And it predicts success in college better than SAT scores and actually better than high school GPA, which has traditionally been like the best predictor of how you'll do in college. Conscientiousness of the highest, because in college, a lot of things are self-directed, right? Like, yeah, you have assignments and stuff, but sometimes you get to decide when you're finishing them, when you're turning them in, right? So being high in conscientiousness will help you succeed. Interestingly, even though it predicts college performance, it's not related at all to IQ. Which we know, like, college success isn't all really related to IQ, right? You can be a really smart person, but just not, like, apply yourself, not be conscientious, and you could fail out of college. One of my good friends in college, brilliant guy, just like one of those people that when you talk to him, you're like, you can just see his mind working, right? Just didn't turn in a major project one day before he left for winter break, just left it on his desk. So he failed the class, right? Having more conscientiousness would have helped him. It might explain motivation in general. It predicts a longer life expectancy, which if we just think about like health outcomes, that makes sense, right? If you're more conscientious, you might be a person who is going to exercise more, go to preventative care doctor's appointments, things along those lines. It's also positively correlated with years of schooling. So the more years of schooling you have, the more likely you are to be high in conscientiousness. Again, because it takes a lot of tenacity and a lot of self-governance to not only go through college, but then persist through, say, a master's or a PhD. Extroversion. These folks are social, outgoing, active, outspoken, sometimes dominant, and adventurous. Some big advantages of being high on extroversion are these folks tend to be higher status, partially because we know part of how the business world works is networking, right? You get ahead by networking. And if you've ever had to schmooze at a cocktail party type event, and you are an introvert at heart like me, it is painful. I hate those events. I'm always super awkward. Like, I don't know who to talk to. But an extrovert is just like, oh, blah, blah, blah. And that can help you advance. People who are extroverted tend to be rated as more popular and physically attractive, even if they're the same level of physical attraction objectively as an introvert. And they have more positive emotions, so it can be helpful for your mental health. And again, that makes sense if we think about humans as pack animals, right? Of people who thrive off sociality. Disadvantage can be mate poaching. It cause a lot of problems, right? If you steal somebody's boyfriend, girlfriend, partner. In terms of life outcomes, these folks tend to be happy, grateful, they have long lives, they're healthy, they have successful relationships. And again, I think a lot of this is, we know that being social is healthy for humans. If you're extroverted, you're less likely to have difficulties making that phone call to set up that doctor's appointment, right? It's like, it kind of cracks me up because when I was growing up, I'm an elder millennial, an Oregon Trail generation. Like, we talked on the phone all the time because we didn't really have like the internet. The internet was like really coming into its own when I was in high school. So we just talked on the phone instead of like texting, because that didn't exist, or like doing like online chatting, which was more of the thing when I was in college. But now every single millennial I know is like, I don't want to call, I don't want to talk to someone. I just want to like email them. I want to make my appointment online. And I don't know how that shift happened, but it did. I guess it's 2 presidential election cycles ago. Someone called me from like a campaign for Hillary, and they were like trying to be really chipper. And I was like, please take me off your list and please don't call me. Like, this is the most millennial thing I've ever said. I actually said that to them. But I was like, the only time someone calls me when it's not planned is if like someone's in the hospital. So please don't call me. Right? Interesting to think about. Agreeableness. Sometimes you'll see this balanced in the opposite way as aggressiveness is considered the other end of the spectrum from this. These are folks who tend to conform, comply, but they're likable and warm. They tend to be cooperative and easy to get along with. Random factoid is they smoke less. Don't really know why that's related, but it is. Women tend to be higher on agreeableness than men, I think, because of socialization in our culture, right? Like, women are sort of taught, it's not quite as bad as like you should be seen and not heard now, right? But it's definitely like, you should be nice, otherwise you're going to be perceived in really bad ways, right? I read an interesting thread on Threads last night where a professor was talking about how she was like a young female professor, had a student come to her and like accuse her of like, how dare you give me bad participation points when I didn't participate, right? Which like sounds silly, but like people complain about stuff like this sometimes. And like just would not leave her office. And how scary that was. And like women were chiming in and talking about like, yeah, I find that I have to like act like a mom and be like, I understand why you're feeling this way. Then other people were like, why the hell do we have to act like moms? So we're not. And then other women were saying, well, you know, when I just sort of act professionally, like my male colleagues, I'm labeled as intimidating, right? And so this is sort of like socialized for women. Be agreeable, and maybe you'll get ahead if you're lucky, right? Among children, really interestingly, they are less vulnerable to being bullied if they just kind of go with the flow. Might mean that they're really upset inside though, right? So it's not always good. People who are high on agreeableness nodes do tend to be psychologically well adjusted, have healthy hearts, and have a lot of dating satisfaction. Neuroticism is the only sort of negatively valenced big five trait, and it is linked or called emotional instability. Old school neuroticism as a term sort of meant anxiety, but also sort of encompassed depression and some of the other internalizing disorders. So people who are neurotic have very ineffective problem-solving abilities. They have strong negative reactions to stress. Being high on neuroticism is negatively correlated with happiness, well-being, and physical health. They have a greater tendency towards some sort of psychopathology, again, whether that's like an anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, eating disorder. And then in terms of life outcomes, they tend to have problems in family and other relationships. They tend to be dissatisfied with their jobs. And then on the extreme, they might be involved in criminal behavior. And so I love this chart because you can see that in different cultures, the exact same traits, which are arranged in the columns up and down, can be called a lot of different things. Seems to be consistently the same in some traits, and then a lot of variation, right? So like looking at extroversion, something like social adaptability or surgency, power, sort of an interesting way to think about that. Agreeableness, some people have called it like conformity. Likability, love. Conscientiousness has sometimes been called the will to achieve, or just responsibility, or work. Neuroticism has sometimes just been labeled like emotional control or emotionality. I personally feel like that is more accurate, but then we don't get the OCEAN acronym, right? So, and then openness to experience is the one that, as I mentioned, varies quite a bit. And so sometimes it's called like intelligence or intellect. And sometimes it's like inquiring intellect or culture. So again, that one has the most variation. When you look at the big five, when it's translated to other languages, we do tend to see 4 or 5 of the factors appear. So that's if we take an existing big five measure, we translate it into a different language. If you start from the other language, maybe you use a lexical approach and go through their dictionary and look for trait terms. What we find is there's some overlap, but there's no one-to-one correspondence of the traits. So like if the lexical hypothesis is true, that suggests that the big five is not universal. So Yang and Bond looked at the big five in different cultures. And in particular, they looked at it in Taiwan compared to like the US. Some of their conclusions, shockingly, different cultures are different. There's an enormous variation in people within a culture, which makes sense, right? If we just think about like folks in this room, we would probably all score very differently on a big five inventory. Each culture uses different words to study people's personalities. And so it's sort of like, where do we come off as Americans applying our theories to other cultures, right? It's just like colonization of research. We also have to think about it sort of nomothetically, that definitional level, versus idiographic. How does it apply to a person standing in front of you? So some other ways of looking at the big five, and again, OCEAN's a really nice acronym to help you remember them. Goldberg back in 1981 translated the big five from like trait terms to questions. So for openness, he made it more about intellect. Is the person smart or dumb? And conscientiousness, is this person responsible? Extroversion, is this person active and assertive? Agreeableness, is this person warm and pleasant? And then neuroticism, is this person emotionally stable? And so these are what they found for Yang and Bond. Again, they'd found different factors in this Taiwanese sample than they did in the American sample. And so they found that openness to experience was related to social orientation, competence, impotence, which might be related to conscientiousness, but it's not quite the same thing. Expressiveness and self-control. It was most linked to this competence, impotence. Conscientiousness was also related to social orientation, competence, impotence, but then self-control was the highest. Extroversion is related to social orientation, but highest correlated with expressiveness. Agreeableness was most related to social orientation and self-control, but also linked to competence, impotence, and expressiveness. So again, as you're seeing, lots of overlap, right? And then neuroticism was related to sort of the one that seemed to map onto it the most, optimism and neuroticism, but it correlated the highest with this competence, impotence. So again, really suggesting you can't just copy paste the big five onto different cultures, right? It might not work in the same way, particularly if the culture is more collectivistic. There are a lot of really interesting life outcomes associated with the various personality traits. So extroversion, I mentioned some of these. They have peer acceptance. They tend to have occupational satisfaction, community involvement. They tend to be in leadership positions. And again, these are people who are high on these traits. I slip into this language myself sometimes too, but like sometimes people just be like, yeah, if you have extroversion or not, right? And it's not, it's a continuum, right? So we should sort of think about that. Agreeableness, folks tend to be involved in religion. They tend to be easy to forgive other people, rather. They have humor, heart health, longevity, psychological health, peer acceptance, dating satisfaction, social interest, job attainment, avoiding that criminal behavior. Conscientiousness, tend to have religious beliefs, good health habits, longevity, avoiding drugs. It makes me laugh about thinking about, I had a good friend in grad school who is very conscientious. And she decided before she became a therapist, she needed to try pot. I don't know why, this just was like a thing for her. And I wasn't there, but she and her boyfriend at the time both told me the story that she just got completely paranoid. And like every time like a police or an ambulance went by, she was like, they're coming for me. So yeah, this could be one of the reasons why conscientious people do not enjoy drugs, right? They have family and dating satisfaction, job performance, occupational success. They do tend to be politically conservative, and they avoid criminal behavior. Neuroticism, we see unhappiness, poor coping, poor family relation, criminal behavior, occupational dissatisfaction. And then openness to experience is related to forgiveness, inspiration, as I mentioned, trying substances and sometimes abusing them, artistic interests, and more political liberalism. Which is just sort of interesting to think about, like, what if you have someone who's high on openness to experience and conscientiousness? Like, where are they going to end up on the political spectrum? Probably depends on the person. So, in terms of criticisms of the big five, some people have argued these aren't orthogonal. Some of these traits are really highly intercorrelated. So it's like, are they actually measuring different things? Maybe not. Other people argue there's more personality than just 5 traits, right? Like, we need to be more broad in our scope. And other people have argued the other way and said that these traits are too broad for conceptual understanding. we're trying to characterize other traits as combinations of big five traits that can leave out important concepts. So if we take our concept of authoritarianism we talked about on Wednesday, if you try to just think about that as a combination of big five traits, you're going to leave out a lot of the nuance of it, right? And the essence of it. Another thing that we can do is use a typological approach to personality. And this is based on doubt about whether it's valid to compare people quantitatively on trait dimensions. Instead, you sort the patterns of traits into types. Really interestingly, when I learned the MMPI 2, this was a big part of interpretation, because they would kind of do a typology based on where you scored highest, which is really, in my opinion, unnecessary. There are important differences between people, and those may be qualitative, right? Those might be more nuanced rather than like strictly measured by a survey. Some challenges here are finding the divisions that distinguish different types, right? So even if you're putting traits into types, you still have to like categorize, right? And that becomes like, now you've just moved it up a little bit in terms of like how you're categorizing people, right? And then another thing is coming up with basic types that characterize the whole range of personality. There do tend to be 3 replicable types you can find over and over in various different studies. One is being well-adjusted. So people who are adaptive, flexible, resourceful, successful interpersonally. Then there's maladjusted, over-controlling. People who are too uptight, people who are difficult to deal with, and they might deny themselves pleasure. So this is like Freud's anal retentive personality, or type A personality, we often call this, or people with obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Then there's maladjusted, under controlling. These are people who are too impulsive. They might even engage in dangerous activities. They wreak havoc on themselves and others. The problem with types is that they are not any more predictive than just looking at the individual traits. So you might do all this work to like categorize this person in a type, and then you're not getting any more information. Is it useful to think of people in terms of types? Yes, maybe, right? It's a summary of your standing on several traits. It can make it easier to think about how traits within a person interact with each other, but it's not going to be a like immediate, perfect, we explain the whole person. There are general criticisms of the trait approach, and you are going to read one of these for Monday. Some people just argue that the factors, the traits are abstractions. And that factor analysis doesn't add anything to the data, we're just grouping things, so is that actually necessary or helpful? Some people argue it's just too early in the history of psychology and with the knowledge we know to try to quantify things in this area. The trait approach also does not address development at all. It does not develop how do you become high on extroversion, right, or high on openness to experience. There are relatively static traits, so both data and common sense suggest individual different variables don't necessarily operate like that. There are subtle interactions. Trait theorists acknowledge, yeah, this is a problem. There are some holes in our approach. Another issue is that people are just inconsistent, right? Personality traits are not the only factors that control behavior. Situations are also important. Some people argue, like, do traits even exist? Is everybody basically the same and our behavior just changes with the situation? Trait stability increases with age, and it is related to psychological adjustment, so that suggests something, right? Michelle is who you'll read from, who is a big critic of traits. And he says that behavior is too inconsistent across situations for individual differences to be characterized by traits. So we know that people exist, we know that situations exist, and we know that people exist within situations, right? So situationisms, there we go. View of human nature is that people are free to do what they want. Everybody's equal, and any differences that exist are a function of the situation. So some people, based on their traits, might be more likely to have bad outcomes. Personality's view of human nature is that people can develop consistent identities and styles that allow them to be themselves across situations. Again, going back to our Casper the Ghost example. How do we have resolved this person situation debate? Funder says people maintain their personalities even as they adapt their behavior to particular situations. A little bit of a cop-out, right? But also accurate. And the conclusion here is, and people can flexibly adapt to situations and have a generally consistent personal style. So our conclusion is that people are psychologically different, and those differences matter. But the situation can also impact what happens and how you react in a given moment. Alrighty, we finished up a little early today. I think no one's probably sad about that on a Friday. Thank you all for being here. And I will see you on Monday for discussion day.